and just reflect on what's going to be a great hour and a half. Thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, so if we want to share the presentation, then we can, thanks Tracy. So yeah, if you go to slideshow now, and then you can drive for Lynette, and I'll as I said, really very much welcome questions or comments in the chat, or please feel free to raise your hand.
Can we put it onto full screen?
So if we go over to the slideshow, across there, Tracy, up
to the right hand corner.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't have my mic on. How do I get it to full screen?
So if you go onto the top red ribbon, there's like the little across a little bit more. That one.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thanks.
There we go. Brilliant. Right. So yeah, Lynette, if you'd like to introduce yourself. So I always forget mine. So I'm Lucy Walsh, Advanced Public Health Practitioner within Cornwall Council's Public Health team, with a responsibility for children, young people and families. And a big thanks today to Tracy from Head Start, who's going to be supporting us with the presentation. And I'll hand over to Lynette for her introduction.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So thank you very much for attending today's session. My name is Dr. Lynette Rentoul, and by my background and training, I'm a consultant clinical psychologist. I'm also an adult psychoanalytic psychotherapist, and for very many years, I've worked in the National Health Service, both in children's mental health services and in adult mental health services, and in community settings and in inpatient settings. So that's my background. More recently, I worked for a number of years for trauma-informed schools, and I'm currently the clinical lead for CAMS for the local CCG, advising them on how to spend their money on mental health. I don't hold the purse strings, but I give advice. So I hope that that's enough information about me. So this project came about, which is a highly collaborative tripartite project between the CCG, Public Health and Head Start, and it's been a really productive collaboration, and I thank my colleagues in Head Start. Thank you, Tracy, and your colleagues, and Lucy Walsh in Public Health. Thank you, Lucy, and your colleagues, and myself for the local CCG. And so it was funding of my time and writing and the publications through Public Health and the communications through Head Start. It's a lovely cross-Cornwall collaboration. So just to say the context of this is that guidances in relation to common mental health issues were written between 2017 and 2019, and they're somewhat detailed guidances. They're about 30 pages or so long. And those guidances on 4 topics relating to mental health: self-harm, eating disorders and eating problems, anxiety, and resilience and pro-social development. Those were 4 guidances, and they were written in some detail, and they're toolkits with advice and guidance and information and conversation ideas, as well as some background information. Those detailed guidances have gone out to schools, both in hard copies and in electronic versions. So check with your school that you have access to those. But I believe that we are sending out both the guidance, the detailed guidance, and the PowerPoint today to today's group, so you will have your own access to it. And as you heard earlier, Head Start are videoing these, and these recordings will be kept so that if you or your colleagues want to watch them later, then that's also fine. So those guidances are longer, and this is a rather shortened version, just to sort of think about some of the issues raised and to give a review of them. So just to say that those of you that would welcome more information or brochures or handouts that you can give to young people or to parents or conversation openers, they are already in your guidance, although I'm happy to answer questions on those today. I do hope that that's enough background, and the idea is this is just fleshing out what you already have, but make sure you have access to it. Next slide, please.
Lynette, I'm really sorry, I'm going page down. Lucy, how do I move across?
When I've shared it before, it's just 2 arrows. So it's the arrow face right there. If you drop down there we go. Excellent.
Thank you.
Spot the person who hasn't done this before.
No, don't worry. Every day's a school day for everyone. So yeah, I don't know if you went on a couple there. Did you? Is that the first page, Lynette?
No, that's the first page. Thank you.
There we go. Well
so
done.
what do we mean by an eating problem? This is just an introduction. I want to say at the very beginning that I worked very closely with young people in developing the guidance, and I also worked with a group of parents in developing this guidance, and that was facilitated by YPC, Young People Cornwall. So I'm very grateful, and I want my gratitude noted to YPC. But when we developed this together, myself, the young people, and parents of young people, all of whom had an eating disorder, we did not address the issue of something called ARFID. The initials of that are ARFID, and that's a restrictive eating disorder. And it's slightly different from the others, and I will explain as we go through, but I haven't fleshed out ARFID as much as anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating in this presentation, partly because ARFID is a relatively new concept since 2014 or so. It's a relatively new concept. The idea isn't, we've recognized for a very long time that some young children, almost from the point of weaning, but throughout primary school as well as secondary school, have restricted their eating hugely, not because of concerns about their body or because of pronounced emotional difficulties, but much more in relation to the texture, the color, the feeling about the food itself. And there's a kind of almost disgust response to some foods if they're the wrong color or the wrong texture or they're not familiar. And this problem is much more common among children with learning disabilities or who have an autistic spectrum condition. It's much more common among that population, but not exclusively so, and tends to have a long history. It isn't that I won't address ARFID at all in today's presentation, but some of these PowerPoints are not addressing ARFID in particular. But when it comes to schools and guidance about what we do if we have a child, let's say as an example, who is on the autistic spectrum and who has a highly restricted diet, and it may be a function of color or texture, I will give some ideas of how we think about that in school settings, in particular, what's supportive and what actually isn't supportive, even though intuitively it may feel to be supportive. I hope that that's clear. So an eating problem is when eating habits simply become unhealthy. That's the nature of it. It becomes a problem. And that is when a young person might persistently eat too little or eat too much or eat in unhealthy ways, such as taking in too much food and making themselves sick. These are the beginnings of problems. And in understanding the background, we recognize that with most of these problems, and not necessarily so with what we call ARFID, but with most of these problems, there is a very, very important social and emotional and psychological underlying pressure within these young people that is hard to resolve and somehow gets resolved through the body. We know that it can be very scary when you're a teenager and your body changes very suddenly. I mean, there's a feeling of it becoming almost unfamiliar, that we don't have any control over it. And sometimes we can feel very uncomfortable with our body, especially the development, the psychosexual developments, or the shift in size of our body, or the powerful shifts in shape of our body. But these changes normally pass with time, and normally we kind of get used to it and we accept it and we recognize it and we see it in others. Although obviously if our body changes in a slightly different time scale to others, either ours doesn't develop or it develops early or quickly, then that can be very discomforting for children. Many children do, by the way, try normally dieting for the first time in their teens. They kind of have a go, or there's pressure from social media, or when their body changes, they don't know how to take control of it. But this only becomes unhealthy if they're putting either their physical or their mental health at risk, and then it becomes a real eating problem. Many young people become very self-conscious about their body shape and the changes, especially in the eyes of other people. Teenagers can become very, very sensitive to what they imagine other people see in them and see in their bodies, and are very prone to feelings of discomfort and embarrassment at hair or changes in shape and size and how we look. And so we can be full of embarrassment or even shame or just real discomfort in what we imagine is in the eyes of others. It is becoming a bit more common for younger children, by the way, to have eating problems and eating disorders. And certainly ARFID is likely to begin in primary school age children or even younger. But even some eating disorders, not ARFID, but more like anorexia, may begin as early as primary school years, but the commonest time is in puberty and through to about 25. But whatever age an eating problem occurs, it's not ever just about food. It's about the feelings and the emotions that cause or trigger it. Eating problems become an eating disorder. That's an actual disorder when the young person meets the criteria for a diagnosis, and I can describe those criteria, or you can read about them in the guidance. Next slide, please. So there are many different eating problems, but I'm going to just go over a few of them now. So, but many of them include either restricting food intake associated with weight loss, or overeating where there's increase of weight, or a mixture of those. And it's very interesting, certainly with both ARFID and certainly with bulimia, there may be no changes. The person may be of normal weight. So eating problems can include compulsively overeating, sometimes called binge eating. And if that's diagnosed as a serious problem that's impacting on physiological development, physical health, as well as mental health, it's called BED, that's binge eating disorder. And it's characterized by compulsively eating too much, not recognizing when you've had enough, eating very, very quickly, and eating large amounts. And I'll go into some detail about that. Another eating problem is when a young person or an adult overeats, eats too much, eats very quickly, eats a large amount, and then follows that by what's called purging. That is getting rid of that very quickly, not through the body's normal digestive processes, either by the use of laxatives or making oneself sick or hugely excessive exercise. And this is referred to as bulimia or anorexia or bulimia. And with bulimia, as I've already said, there may be no weight loss or gain, or there may be. Another eating disorder, which I've already described very, very briefly, is called avoidant restrictive eating disorder. And this is when the young person, it's not driven by a concern with body shape or body size or pronounced psychological discomfort with the body. This is when the food itself and the sensory aspects of the food or something about the food itself becomes the focus, and where the diet is restricted to only textures or colors or brand products that the child feels safe with. So there's an overwhelming anxiety that if the wrong texture or the wrong color comes in, it's dangerous. They might choke, or they might be sick, or it may be harmful to them. This leads the child to only eat a rather limited range of food. There may or may not be weight gain or weight loss. There often is, though, weight loss. These are often children who have nutritional deficiencies, and it is often associated with learning disabilities or autistic spectrum conditions. I've been doing some research recently with both the Maudsley and Great Ormond Street. Now, in their large populations of research, about 50% of their children are on the autistic spectrum or have a learning disability. And when you recognize that in the general population, it's much smaller than that, you can see how overrepresented children on the autistic spectrum are. Eating problems include, in general, with the exception, yes, unhealthy attitudes to food, including very secretive eating or the feeling of shame associated with eating, or feeling very guilty, or abnormal behaviors in relation to food. Underlying eating problems, again, with the exception of ARFID, although ARFID I will talk about, are very marked emotional, sensory, and relationship problems that in themselves require to be understood and attended to. We cannot deal with an eating problem as if it were an eating problem, like just saying eat more or eat less or eat healthy. We have to attend to the whole person and to the emotional and the relational and the social pressures that that young person is seeking to deal with by controlling their body. Next slide, please. So by eating disorders, they're just eating problems that have been diagnosed, and that's because they've met the criteria for diagnosis, which means that these problems are persistent and they're severe, and they have a very marked impact on mental health, physical health, and functioning. So these are children whose body changes during adolescence can be so scary that their anxiety leads to have much greater problems. The mental health threats become greater, and that these are directed and focused on the control of food. A child may, for example, start dieting and then find something in it about giving them control. But if the child is not eating, obviously, a balanced diet over a long period of time, and that restrictive diet, it has impacts on a wide range of physiological functioning, not just losing weight, but for example, with girls, they may stop menstruation, it may impact their digestive system, it may impact their skin, their hair, and their heart. As I've already said, eating problems are not just about food. They are about difficult things in people's lives. They're about painful feelings. They're often about harm or adverse experiences, or they are about internal turmoil which cannot be expressed. It's as if they can't express it, they can't think about it, they can't reflect upon it, they can't process it, and they can't resolve it. And it gets somehow or another expressed through the body because it can't be processed psychologically. In eating disorders, most of young people have marked concerns about their bodies, their weight, their shape, their size, their looks, their idea of their body image, except ARFID. And in ARFID, the driver isn't so much a concern about body shape, body size, or being beautiful. The driver is the avoidance of certain foods which are felt to be disgusting because of their color or their texture or their lack of familiarity. By focusing on food, it does give the child a sense of control, but it may also disguise the problems. It's as if this, as long as I do this, I don't have any problems. It's a distraction from internal turmoil for which the child can't find a language and can't find a way of thinking about and can't connect. What's really important is that young people and children have support from very safe, understanding adults who are accepting of their difficulties, who are not judging their difficulties, who are not shaming them, and who are not offering them quick but rather cliched answers to their problems. Next slide, please. So who develops an eating disorder? Well, the simple answer is anybody can. Children from all walks of life can develop an eating disorder, from any culture, from any class, from any religion, from any ethnic group. There was a time when girls were 10 times more likely, but it is becoming more common in boys, and I think that figure of 10 times more likely is simply inaccurate and often is not recognized in boys quite so well. Boys, by the way, are equally likely to experience ARFID. There are some risk factors that might be helpful for us to think about. For example, parents who have an obsessive interest in weight convey that both directly and indirectly to their children. Peer pressure, social media, the development of image of a particular body shape or body idea that's idealized. Undue interest and concern with being popular and attractive, where being popular and attractive is seen as being beautiful in a particular way, having a particular body shape. A hatred of one's body. Young people who are overwhelmed by worries that they can't understand and that they can't process and get control through their body. Young people who have limited coping skills, such as communication skills or putting things into words or developing strategies to understand the pressures upon them. And some groups of children, like those who are rather perfectionist or those who have what we call black and white thinking, where it's hard to find the middle ground, are a little bit more prone to. With anorexia and bulimia, and in part to compulsive eating, the years between 12 and 25 are the most common, but young children or younger children can develop eating disorders and problems, and certainly ARFID commonly starts in either preschool or primary school years. It's also important to know that many children who develop an eating disorder are not known to any services at all and cannot state any clear or obvious triggers for their difficulties. Next slide, please. I just thought that it would be helpful to put in a quote, a young person's view. I'll just leave you to read that yourselves. You see, I think that this is a really helpful quotation because it conveys the idea that anorexia, for example, or my eating disorder, you call it a problem, but from my point of view, it's a friend. It solves problems for me. It gives me a sense of control. It makes me feel quite powerful. And so I don't necessarily want you to attack it or take it away from me. I need you to help me overall as a human being. So I think that this ambivalence about the anorexia in the minds of young people is really important to grasp, that it is sometimes experienced, often powerfully, as a friend or a helpful coping strategy, even if it is regarded by the adults around the young person with utter dismay. Next slide, please. In this description, I'm not including ARFID. I can talk for a moment about ARFID, and then I'm going to take a pause just to check with you that this presentation is helpful to you and that it's the right level. I'm just going to pause in a moment because I don't want to just talk non-stop for the whole time. So why do children and how do children develop eating problems that may or may not become eating disorders? For many children, they describe moving into adolescence and the changes that accompany puberty and the social changes that accompany that, and the complexity of secondary school life or the development of primary and secondary sexual characteristics can be very confusing for young people and kind of throw them and make it feel as if the ground on which they walk is no longer safe and secure, and it can leave them feeling out of control, as if they're walking on a moving landscape and they're liable to fall over. But they develop a way, either accidentally or deliberately or through talking to other young people or watching media or however, that if they starve themselves or if they really take powerful control over what they eat, that this is one thing they can control. It feels very powerful. This I have in hand. For some young people who long to be popular and confuse looking slim and beautiful, you know, with a particular body image like models or celebrities with being attractive in a particular way. And there's no question here that the role of social media plays a part. In other words, what we're saying is that eating problems and disorders are biological, psychological, and social, and that the social media plays into that part of it. For some young people, they feel that they just aren't good enough, and that if they can make themselves good by creating this perfect body image, they might feel better and might even be more popular. Some young people hate their body, including if something's happened to them, for example, if they've been harmed or abused. Many young people who eat very small amounts to take control over their body have a very unrealistic view of their body shape and may see themselves as fat or overweight when they are not, or when they indeed may be quite thin. There's a longing to achieve an unrealistic body image. In their minds, it's this perfectionist approach of what the perfect body is, which has no fat on it, or which is really difficult when you're engaged in puberty, and puberty is taking over, because that does lead us to have a changing body shape with fatty tissue. For some young people, they started a diet just, for all sorts of reasons that are not necessarily to do with problematic eating, and then found that they liked the feeling it gave them and that they were unable to stop. Or some young people are through illness, can't eat or stop eating, or have been in hospital and can't eat, and then they can't start again, or they've had a fearful incident such as choking or being sick, and then they become very afraid of that. So it starts in a particular way, and then they like the consequences of it. For some young people who are not restricting their eating but are compulsively overeating, may feel that they're not able to stop because the feeling of taking in food gives them a great sense of comfort. But they have to keep taking in more and taking it in more quickly, because they long for that moment of feeling full and not empty and not lost. However, that feeling of being satisfied and full doesn't last long, so they need more and more. And when I work with young people like this, it almost has a kind of addictive quality to it. I must get more in, I must get more in, to feel a bit fuller, to feel that feeling of satiated, but it doesn't last, so you have to put more in. Some young people are overwhelmed with strong feelings of confusion and distress that they can't express, they can't face, and they can't manage. But somehow or another, by turning it on its head and focusing on their body and controlling that, gives them a sense of both distraction from emotional difficulties or adversity or social problems, and gives them a sense of a kind of sublime control. the other factor that increases risk are family members who worry obsessively about food and being overweight or restricting intake. I'll just do one more slide and then I'll pause. One more slide, please. So these are just some of the risk factors that I've already spoken about. The perfectionist personality, the personality that thinks in very, very black and white. There's no middle ground, must do it this way, only that works. It's got to be that number or nothing else. A personality that is terrified of that feeling of being out of control and wobbling and doesn't like the grey areas and doesn't like unfamiliarity and doesn't like uncertainty and doesn't like the unfamiliar changes in their body and needs to really take control because the terror of being out of control is unbearable. These are young people who have particular difficulties in coping with change, including changes in their body. For some young people, life experiences such as constant teasing, constant bullying leads to a pressure that can't be processed and can't be dealt with and is dealt with in this way. Harmful life experiences increase the likelihood of some eating problems, in particular bulimia. Prior illness, those children who were not able to eat or had restrictive eating or couldn't eat because they were ill, with a loss of appetite and then can't find their way back in again, close relative with someone who's had an eating disorder, a parent who's overly concerned about shape and weight, very, very strong values about the importance of being thin and idealizing thinness. But some young people with all these risk factors may not develop an eating disorder, and also many people who develop an eating disorder may have none of these risk factors. And that's our dilemma, that there is no single factor that leads a person to have an eating disorder. It's a very complex interaction of events and factors. We just know that some things make it a bit more likely, or when we're going backwards and making sense, we can begin to develop a narrative about an eating problem and how it developed into an eating disorder. I will pause for a moment now just to get a little bit of feedback from people. Is this what you were hoping for? Is this the right level? And do you have any really kind of important questions that you want to ask now in relation to anything that I've said?
Great, thank you, Lynette. Yeah, we'll give people time to feel free to raise your hand or pop a message in the chat, or even just a thumbs up or a reaction if you'd like to share. Please don't be shy. Some thumbs up coming up there. That's great. For me, just a quick one. It just meant that kind of real reassurance that this is biological, emotional, social. It's such a it's so complex that I hope that some reassurance and confidence will come from today, and appreciate you can't cover it all, but we've got the toolkit to support.
But to remind people that the toolkits, they are much more detailed, and they're much more details about information and conversations to have. So yeah,
that's great. And yeah, we got some messages. All good, very interesting. Thank you. So great emoji there, smiley face. May deal with this later, but kind of the do's and don'ts would be fantastic. And I think, we certainly move on to some of the practical advice and guidance later on in the session. So all looking great.
I do have a list of do's and don'ts. It's a later, it's a later PowerPoint.
Just one specific question here. So thank you, Leslie. Can having anorexia change your brain development?
Shall I explain it?
Yes, probably. I should have invited you to share your question. Thank you.
I'm just going to go in a different room, only because I'm with my colleague and you could hear on the other computer. I'm working with a young person who has anorexia, and she used to be like top of her class, but now she's finding it really difficult. And I didn't know whether I was like reading up about brain matter and wondering whether that actually impacts her having anorexia has impacted her way that she understands stuff at school and like her education. Does that make sense?
It makes absolute sense. Thank you for the question. It's a helpful question. See, here's my thinking on this, that I'm not sure that we're talking about the brain and brain matter, but I think we are talking about the mind. And it's absolutely clear that when we're hungry, or when we are seeking control through eating, or when we're anxious, or when we're holding on to unmanageable feelings and dealing with them by starving ourselves, that our capacity to think and our capacity to process and our capacity to be flexible and our capacity to problem solve and our capacity to follow all sorts of ideas with energy and concentration is affected. Certainly while we're hungry. But the good news is that I know of no evidence where clearly brain matter itself, although we do know that starvation over a very long period of time certainly impacts the endocrine system. That is, periods and hormones, and some aspects of teeth development, hair development are impacted. But mostly I think what you're describing, that difficulty engaging, is the impact of the unresolved emotional and social difficulties and the focus on control to the exclusion of other things, and the anxiety that's driving a lot of this. And I think it's impacting on the mind. It's as if somehow the mind knows it's under threat. It's seeking control through the control of the body, but it's not really coping properly with the underlying things, and it's not allowing the mind to have the energy, the interest, the inclination, and the calm and safe space to explore. So I think what you're describing there is much more. And part of it is when we're hungry, we do need, our brains need food. They absolutely do. But I think when we're, over time, when this young person begins to eat more healthily or eat more or eat enough or more nourishing, that's fine. But I feel that what you're describing are much more the psychological, the emotional, the social, and the cognitive impairments associated with a mind preoccupied with controlling weight. Has that made sense to you?
Yes, it has.
I'm trying to be reassuring because, then we pull it back. If we get more calm, if we can problem solve, if we can become more connected, if we can connect with our relationships, then we can connect with learning and we can feel safe. That's, trauma-informed work tells us that if we don't feel safe and if we're under control and we're trying to work in ways that are not really healthy coping strategies, we're not in a really safe, relaxed place where, in Bowlby's word, we're free to explore. And after all, learning is all about explorations of the mind and interest and engagement with the process of learning about new things. I hope that's helpful to you.
Thank you, Lynette. Yeah, and Leslie commented there and also in the chat. Yeah, that's really great.
Okay.
Very helpful.
Shall we move on to the next slide?
Yeah. With no more questions at the moment, but
okay.
I'll keep an eye.
So I'm just going through the different disorders now, just trying to describe them in a little bit more detail. So anorexia nervosa, or anorexia as an eating disorder, is an eating disorder where you have a very extreme fear of gaining weight. So you just simply eat less and less. And it really is a serious mental health problem if it takes hold, because when it takes hold, it impacts not just on the mind and not just on one's social relationships, but it also starts to create some shifts biologically that makes eating and wanting to eat more difficult. The young person will eat less and less, will exercise too much on a regular basis. The young person may then begin to feel very panicky about eating in front of others. They may feel very panicked by the idea of what they would describe as a big meal, but maybe just what we would call an ordinary size meal. that there's a constant fear of feeling fat, or the experience of being fat, even when this is an inaccurate body image, and when actually many people are very, very concerned that indeed they're too thin. So there's a very unrealistic and inaccurate view of one's body shape and one's body size. That there's almost an obsessive interest with one's body shape, with one's body size, a preoccupation with restriction and control, and a great interest in comparing oneself to the bodies of others. This is not a happy state, though. Although it feels as if the person's in control and there's a kind of powerful feeling with it, it's also associated with low mood and irritability. You know, young people also know that the adults around them are often very concerned and are checking, have you eaten enough? Are you all right? So it may lead them to develop a narrative where they're not truthful about what they're eating, or saying, yes, I've eaten, or I had a good lunch today, or I've drunk plenty, or I had a breakfast this morning, when they did not. And they may also try to lose weight through other ways as well, as restricting food, ways that we've already described, so vomiting or using laxatives, or excessive exercise. That's an introduction to anorexia. Next slide, please. And it's associated with losing lots of weight, and often very, very quickly. In the more detailed guidance and toolkits, I do reference some ways of just keeping an eye and doing screens in schools. So I have referred to some of those. For young girls, their periods may stop. For young boys, they may no longer be able to have an erection. Young people may feel cold all the time, even when it's not cold outside, because of poor circulation. They may have poor sleep, and as I already said in the previous one, it has impacts on concentration. So they have poor concentration because they're hungry. And they may have unexpected soft hair growth on body parts, which is called languor hair. And that's quite indicative of not eating enough. Next slide, please.
Oh, Lynette, just stop you there. Just a question in the chat. Are there issues with anorexia and drinking too much liquid to replace eating and food?
Well, I don't know of a particular answer to that, but obviously we need to be able to drink and to eat. Although obviously, when some people, for example, if you've got a broken jaw, you can take highly nutritional things, or as part of some cancer treatments or whatever, you can have highly nutritional drinks that provide huge calorific intake. But I'm suspecting that that's not the question, and that somehow or another the young person is keeping themselves well enough by drinking, but not eating. It's not a healthy way, because we need enough nutrition, and we also need for our digestive system, we need something called roughage, and we need a mixed diet, which includes vegetables and a range of proteins, which we can't normally get through drinks. But it may well be a control, because if we don't drink, then we don't survive. So we know that we can manage survival and get just enough nutrition by drinking, but it may well be another way of exhibiting and taking a huge amount of control while still managing weight loss. I hope.
Thank you, Lynette. It's I don't know if Nick would like to come on and confirm if that answers your question, or if you'd like to.
Yeah, hi. So really, I was thinking more of water rather than nutritional drinks, or food replacements. So not the kind of thing that you might have for a particular diet, but literally just drinking water to feel full, and then the kinds of issues that might kind of follow that.
Yeah, because it's part of controlling diet. So it is one way of feeling slightly less hungry. If you drink a lot of water before a meal, you feel slightly less hungry. So it's part of a control mechanism then.
Thank you. And Daniel, I don't know if you'd like to raise your just elaborate on your comment there around
Yeah, hi,
waterboarding?
sorry.
No, thank
Put my
you.
camera on as well, I'll wave. Hi.
That's Hello.
So I worked at Siena last year, the mental health unit in Bobbin for young people. And we had a massive issue with waterboarding. So young people who would decline food would then take on water, so they're so when we weigh them, it looks like they've put on the weight, as opposed to but it's false weight because it's gonna wee right out, if you will. So we found it was a massive issue. I don't think it will be a big issue in primary, because I can't imagine they've got the concept of what waterboarding is. But at secondary, I know from history, I had a lot of students who were waterboarding, sadly. Yeah, it's a horrible thing, but it's more around keeping away from the consequence, or keeping consequences hidden, if you will.
Well, it's as I said, Daniel, thank you so much. That's very helpful. But it's just a further way of controlling weight loss and managing it. Thank you. I mean, partly it assuages appetite, and partly your body holds water, so you weigh a little bit more if you're being subjected to weighing as part of a treatment regime. Thank you, Daniel. So with bulimia, we have cycles of overeating followed by purging. So overeating, that's binge eating, eating very, very quickly, eating fast amounts, eating when one's not hungry, getting a lot of food down in a very short period of time, and then making oneself sick, or using diet pills or using laxatives to get rid of the food. These young people may also think obsessively about weight, but they may also think obsessively about food. Binge eating is often a preoccupation with eating and a preoccupation with food, and a longing to have that feeling of being filled with food. But that longing and that filling is often followed immediately by feelings of disgust and then purging. It's a profoundly ambivalent stance in relation to food, a longing to feel full and then a disgust and wanting to reject. So it's a very, very profound ambivalence in relation to food and eating. The young person may take laxatives to purge, or they may vomit, they may exercise far too much on a regular basis. When I work with young men, the young men told me that in sports clubs there are many young men who are purging themselves to control their weight by hugely over-exercising. But many young people can become very secretive in this, because there's something in their minds, and possibly in the minds of others, that's rather shameful, partly about the greediness that they feel in trying to get as much food in as quickly as possible, but also the disgust that they feel may be observed by others in terms of the purging that they do. So they're maybe more secretive, there's more shame, there's more embarrassment, isolating oneself, and accompanied by low mood. They may lose interest in things and people, because then food, it's almost as if this cycle and this food takes over. For girls, there are changes in their periods as well. There are often other physiological changes, brittle bones, problems with the throat and the teeth through vomiting, stomach cramps, feeling weak, feeling tired, and often feeling helpless and out of control, because this cycle has still an element of being out of control about it, because it's a cycle, and parts of that cycle one's very much out of control. Next slide, please. So another eating problem is compulsive eating, and this is binge eating, but it's not necessarily accompanied by purging. It's when the young person just feels compelled to eat, even when they're not hungry, or they can't stop eating when they've had enough food, because they're unable to feel satisfied, and they continue to long for the comfort that they get when they feel full. It's as if they just seek that. And then for a moment they feel full, but when they don't feel full, then they have to do it again to try and get that feeling of being satisfied or being full. They regularly eat much quicker than usual. They may eat when they're already full. They may eat when they're not hungry. They may eat alone. They may eat in secret. When they describe their eating patterns, you know, in therapeutic encounters, for example, they may explain that they could eat very large amounts of food, which they know is inappropriate, but somehow or another can't put any reins on. Overeaters often feel very upset and very guilty themselves after these activities, but feel driven to do it. And it's a kind, I've had it described to me as it's almost mindless. I'm driven and I must do it. And it's as if I don't really understand and I don't really get it and I don't know how to stop it. I'm just compelled to do this. Even though you know, young people will tell you, I know it's not healthy or I know I shouldn't. And often in those moments of being driven to eat as much as possible, they can feel quite out of control in relation to eating. And sometimes it's almost as if it's described as having an addiction to food, this longing to get it in, this longing and this satisfaction, which is quite momentary when you've had it and you feel satiated, and then a feeling of discomfort following that. These young people obviously are much more likely to be overweight. Next slide, please. So I've introduced the ARFID slide, which it's a restrictive feeding and intake disorder. It's much more common among young people on the autistic spectrum or with learning difficulties, but not completely so. There is another history that is often associated with harm or with early sickness, early illness, prematurity, problems in weaning. With these young people, it's more that there's an apparent, at least, lack of interest in food or eating at all. Sometimes they don't recognize that they're hungry or don't want to eat very much. These young people have a restricted diet, so they eat very few foods. They may not be able to properly recognize feelings of hunger or thirst. I work with one young lad who didn't drink anything all day, literally nothing all day, no drink, and would drink when he got home from school. The avoidance of food may be based on the sensory characteristics of the food itself, that is, the texture of the food, or the color of the food, or the smell, the feeling of the food, the flavor of it, or it's the wrong brand, or it looks unfamiliar. Even if they're hungry and are presented with something that's unfamiliar or nothing at all, will refuse it because it fills them with fear about what would happen to them to eat something that felt unfamiliar. Often there's a concern about being sick or choking, or the aversive consequences of eating, from their point of view, the wrong thing. There is a preference for certain textures, there's a preference for certain colors or familiar foods. Even it has to be a particular brand. It can't be just like, he'll only eat strawberry yogurt. It has to be, he'll only eat a strawberry yogurt of this brand. So the diet is highly restricted in terms of both the amount and the variety. There may be significant weight loss, a failure to thrive, but there may also be a weight gain, because if the food that is the focus of food is an incredibly unhealthy or highly calorific food, that you will only eat this, but you will eat this over and over, then you can put on weight, or your weight could be in the normal range. So it's important to recognize. By the way, if the food that you take in is restrictive in terms of its healthy content, its protein content, or the mixture of the diet, or recognizing the different aspects of food that we need to be healthy, nutritionally, even if we are of normal weight, nutritionally, our bodies can nonetheless be highly compromised. So there may be significant nutritional deficiencies, which lead to marked health risks. For some young children, it's so difficult for them to swallow food that they're fed through enteral feeding, that is, through other means. And marked interference with functioning. So this ARFID is a, relatively speaking, newly described in terms of disorders, in terms of a classification of mental health disorders. It's relatively new. It's increasingly being recognized. Locally, we are developing services. Locally, we have dietitians who are developing advice and guidance to the early years and are developing training packages. And we are bringing in people from Great Ormond Street to train us more and more. But currently, we don't have a fully fledged ARFID mental health service. Next slide, please. I see that there's a question. Sorry. So, common warning signs of eating problems and disorders. These are the sorts of things that you might be able to recognize yourself or in school through noticing. You might notice that a child experiences rapid weight loss or weight gain suddenly. But a young person may be making food for others constantly or buying food. A young person may be moving about all the time, even when sitting down. A young person during lunchtime may be eating with a teaspoon or using extremely small bowls for ordinary meals, or eating very quickly or eating very, very slowly. Some children, because of nutritional deficiencies, may be very tired, or as somebody noticed earlier, the young person can't concentrate, their grades are falling, they can't engage with the process of learning. Dieting and control of food seem to take over the young person's mind and are the key concerns. You notice that there may almost be an obsession with food or an excessive interest with food. A young person may suddenly start wearing very, very baggy clothes, or wearing heavy clothes even in the summer months to cover their bodies up. They may turn veggie or vegan just so that they can restrict their food more and more and more and more. I'm not saying that being vegetarian or being vegan is a bad thing. We can get a really healthy diet as a vegetarian or as a vegan, but sometimes it's used to mask a very restrictive diet. Food rituals, extremely secretive eating, difficulty in concentrating, children who are tired and who have difficulty in sleeping. Hair loss, you might notice that the young person's clothes are covered in hair because their hair is falling out. Dizziness on standing because they're of nutritional inadequacies. Or children who seem rather cold and are blue and sit next to the radiator even on days that are not cold, or their hands are blue because of poor circulation brought about by inadequate nutrition. So these are some of just the warning signs that you may notice in school. Next slide, please. So I'm moving on now to the importance of getting help, unless anybody wants to ask any more questions about what they are and how they develop. This is more about what we can do. So support is available, but young people may be very scared or very ashamed or very frightened or terrified of losing control or worried about judgment. But in the words of a young person, it's almost as if you don't want the grown-ups who have concern to interfere because they might make you fat. But in this quote, they won't. They want to help and they offer hope. And that's a really key word. We do need support in order to move on. So I thought I'd just summarize by talking about some truths about eating disorders. I will acknowledge my friend and colleague, Mark Woodgate, who came up with these 10 truths, who collaborated in the writing of this and was previously the eating disorders consultant. Next slide, please. People with eating disorders may look healthy. It is possible to mask a quite an unhealthy diet, but they may be very, very unwell. It's important not to stigmatize and blame and judge families. because families are the best allies to young people in treatment. And indeed, the treatment programme in Cornwall, the Cornwall Eating Disorders Service, has family support as a very key component of their treatment intervention. And I work very closely with parents in developing this guidance, and they were extremely helpful to me. An eating disorder diagnosis is a health crisis, but it does disrupt emotional, personal, social, and family functioning. Eating disorders are not choices. By the time it becomes an eating disorder, it is an illness. And saying to a child, you should choose better or you should eat healthier, misses the point that these become, when they are embedded and entrenched, illnesses. Eating disorders affect children and young people from all backgrounds, from very well-to-do, wealthy backgrounds, middle-class backgrounds, and very impoverished backgrounds. Next slide, please. Eating disorders can carry a risk for suicide and medical complications if left untreated, and that includes both bulimia and anorexia nervosa. And of course, if obsessive eating is associated with obesity. Genes alone will not predict who develops an eating disorder. This is a very complex interaction between biological predispositions, an eating problem becoming embedded, and biological factors or illness, but they become embedded and worked with psychological problems, familial problems, and social problems, and the pressure of social networking. Full recovery from an eating disorder is possible, likely. Early recognition and interventions are very, very important in improving well-being and improving outcomes. So we need to get in as early as we can, which is why, in a way, with the schools helping us spot or seeing things early, as well as families, obviously, it can be really helpful. I see that Daniel has asked a question when he worked in the Early Help Hub. We were looking at getting an ARFID pathway in place. We are getting an ARFID pathway in place. We are working on that. To say that a pathway fully with a treatment program is in place would be inaccurate. We are beginning that pathway. We've got early intervention, early years interventions. We've got dietitians and health visitors trained to think about ARFID, both in relation to autistic spectrum conditions, learning disabilities, and in relation to developmental problems associated sometimes with weaning difficulties or prematurity. We are working on that. We are training up those people in the county working with autistic spectrum children and learning disabilities to work with restrictive eating disorders. And we do, in the hospital of Truro, have consultant paediatricians who have and are developing expertise in ARFID. However, to describe that as a fully functioning ARFID pathway with all the aspects of the pathway there, I think would be inaccurate at the moment, but we are working on it. It is seen to be a priority. Daniel, I hope that answers your question. Next slide, please. So this was the question that was asked earlier. What is helpful when responding to eating problems? Well, at the heart of it is something that trauma-informed schools tell us: to be attuned, to be compassionate, to be empathic, to see the whole person, to accept the struggles of the whole person before us, and not to be quick to come up with answers, but to be understanding. So being empathic, being patient, being non-judgmental, listening, being supportive, even when the young person pushes us away. The young people say, see the person and the struggles behind the eating disorders. That is, focus on the struggles, focus on the feelings, don't just focus on the control in the eating. Children tell us, though, it's important to avoid talking about the child's appearance, because this can feel very embarrassing, very shaming, and very worrying for many children. The children ask us to ask you, can you learn as much as you can about eating disorders, which is why we're doing this training for schools, because it's important for everybody to understand that there are powerful emotional and social difficulties underpinning them. It's important to recognize how hard it is for children to talk to you about eating problems. They can be very shaming and very shameful and very embarrassing, and children can be very secretive about them. And it takes a huge amount of courage to name it or talk about it. And that needs to be recognized. Just if a child does talk to you and says, I'm struggling with this, to say, thank you so much. I can imagine that wasn't an easy thing to say to me, is very helpful. It's important, though, even with our good intentions, not to say to a young child, just eat more, or put pressure on a young person, eat or finish that, because this can have an adverse effect. And even, by the way, children who are recovering and are beginning to eat more, the ongoing psychological problems, the ongoing developmental difficulties, the ongoing struggles, the ongoing pressure socially and social media, they don't disappear overnight. They take quite a while to be attended to as well. It's important to accept the young person's very mixed feelings about their own eating problems. They may really hate what they're doing, but at the same time feel as if they need to, and feel as if the starvation at least gives them the sense of control, and like it's almost a friend or an ally that helps them control. But nonetheless, you can voice your concerns. You can say, you know, I understand all of that and I can see your struggle, but I think that it would be helpful for you to get some support for this, because otherwise you could become unwell. And we know that getting early help stops that likelihood happening. Be an emotionally available adult. Notice changes in the child. And encourage children to get us help as early as possible. And don't wait for things to get worse. This is what the young people asked us to tell you. Next slide, please. So what is not so helpful? Don't expect a young person to get to a healthy weight by just telling them to eat more or making them eat or whatever, because they really need help with their mental health, with their relationships, with their struggles, with their feelings of low self-esteem, with their confusions, with their complex relationship to their own body and their emotional well-being. Don't comment on food and weight. It's not helpful mostly for a young person who's really struggling with this. It's much more helpful to connect with the young person behind the problem and thinking with them about their social and their emotional challenges, their relationship problems. Don't ask a young person to promise just eat something. It's unhelpful. They need help with their underlying struggles. Don't comment on their appearance. Young people tell us, don't say, oh, you're looking a bit fatter now, or you're looking weller, or you're looking more robust, or thank goodness you put on weight. Even if you're trying to be helpful, because what you're trying to convey is, thank goodness you're looking better and healthier, because this may cause concern and distress, because the young person may feel very ambivalent about that. Don't assume the young person's difficulties are their parents' fault, and don't judge their parents. Children in general need their families very much to support their recovery. So don't simply ask them to abandon their eating problems. These are strategies to help them control something, and they are often seen as a safety net in their life. And that whole system takes time to reshape and to shift and to find different coping strategies and to gradually develop a different relationship with their own struggles and their own body and their own confusion and to food. Don't invalidate their distress, even if their attitudes to food seem irrational to you. I mean, if a child just says, I will never, ever eat anything that's red, I won't eat a tomato, it's red. Don't say, well, that's ridiculous. Red food can be fine. I mean, I know you, I'm sure you wouldn't say that's ridiculous, but somehow or another, we have to be very careful that when we're confronted with what appears to us to be rather irrational, you know, like I couldn't, if I drink at lunchtime, I'll be poorly. Well, you and I may know that drinking at lunchtime won't make them poorly, but we have to be very careful about how we address firmly held concrete views about eating. Next slide, please. So the young people, just this is what they wrote themselves. I won't read it out, but I would just ask you to read it. So the young people did this diagram. And they said, this is our view. They took complete ownership on helpful school approaches for children with eating disorders. One of the ones that I haven't spoken about very much so far is how routines and practices at school, that is not about the relationship with any individual children, but the routines and practices at school are often unhelpful for children with eating problems who may not have an eating disorder, or children with eating disorders. And that is that the routines themselves make it very easy for children to skip meals. So, for example, how could a school with over 1,000 pupils only allow 40 minutes for lunch for everybody? How can a school ensure that children get a good choice if they're at the back of the queue and what's left is very restrictive and they don't like? How can a school encourage children to bring healthy packed lunches and eat in healthy ways if there's nowhere for them to sit comfortably with their friends? So part of the message from the children is, can you please think about your school practices and how they are unhelpful for children, and don't help us deliver, you know, have really healthy ways of eating, that we can, even if we're in a queue and we're at the back of the queue, still get nice food. Or even if, you know, if we have a detention, do we have to miss our lunch? Because if I start doing that a few times and I see I'm losing weight, this could become problematic for me. So it's about clubs or detentions in lunchtime. In other words, it's how we protect and are very respectful of plenty of time for lunch, where people can sit and eat, and where whatever time you eat your lunch, whether you're at the front of the queue or the back, there's a good choice and a good range of food, and where you don't have to hurry, and where if you're at the back, you have to miss it or you have to wolf your food down. I mean, I certainly know that in other parts of the world, much more attention is paid to healthy eating practices within schools. So it's just about asking schools really to review the time that they have and the setting that they have and the place where people with packed lunches can go and how food can be enjoyed more. Next slide, please.
Lynette, there's just probably easier for you just to read it, or Dawn posted a comment there. I don't know if you'd like to come off the mute and just share your thoughts.
Hi there. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep, we can. That's fine.
Oh, hello. Thank you so much. I definitely need to please kind of like, oh, I can't think of the word now. Sorry, it's been a long day at court. Reiterate that it's not a blame. It's just that so many referrals and colleagues and social care, child protection meetings we're sitting in regularly, weekly sometimes, where early help isn't able to be accessed because of the waiting lists and the workers are off sick, or because people are burning out, because the system is so stretched and strained, and so early help is always crucial, but it's not really always happening for our young people.
Thank you, Dawn. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Again, we understand that not apportioning blame and recognising the pressures on the service, and certainly someone's followed Katie up your thoughts there about more prevention work, which obviously rings very true to me in public health, who we're looking at that real early prevention. And Lynette, I think it was really interesting what you were saying about the environment that the schools or settings can provide for the eating and sharing meals together, which, as you said, culturally is an incredibly important social interaction, as well as for its kind of, functioning of giving us energy. It actually is a place where relationships are formed and conversations are had, and it was very interesting. I know a lot of schools had to very quickly adapt during COVID. I know my own daughters had to have their school dinners in the classroom, for example, and there was, they were just, and just the difference a nice tablecloth or some fruit or a salad bar can make, which in terms of those preventative kind of wider actions, we can probably look to share some resources on that around. And also the other thing to mention, which again does link to this, is that public health are doing work constantly with the school food standards trust, I think, and about those the quality of the school food and the provision, and how seasonal it is, and of course maintaining taste as well. So, but thank you for sharing that, Dawn.
Yeah, and just to further reiterate what you were saying, Lucy, when young people said, it's if you get a detention and it's a lunchtime detention, that's no lunch. Or if I'm at the back of the queue, by the time I get to the front, there's no food. Or my school has only 40 minutes for lunch. It's not possible for us to do it. Or, there's nowhere to sit that's really comfortable for my packed lunch and eat it, so I don't eat it. I've worked with families where they say, my children come home and the lunch bag is still full. So it's partly about thinking about that environment and really thinking in a very friendly way about how we make that easier. Next slide, please. So this again was the young people wrote this one. I had no input into this. It's very interesting. I was with the young people when they wrote this, and they said that, always talking about food and losing weight, for example, science staff and sports staff, as part of their curriculum, may find themselves talking about BMI and weight loss without necessarily recognizing that there are young people in that group who are really, really struggling with eating problems and eating disorders, and that it's spoken about in either an ill-informed way or in an unhelpful way. Now, that's not for all, because obviously in science these things are discussed, and we must discuss them, but we don't necessarily have to discuss weight loss, and certainly among sports staff. So I'm not quite sure what the context was at, but I can remember the conversation very, very clearly. And you can see here that the young people talked about inadequate time and space for eating lunch, which makes missing meals easy and nobody notices. And then you get into the habit, and then you start noticing, oh my goodness, I've lost weight, this is a good thing. And you can get drawn into a vicious cycle. Make sure children with packed lunches don't have to stand out. They don't want to feel different. Allow them to pick up with other packed lunches. Constantly talking about healthy eating rather than balanced eating. Problems of calorie counting in classes, commenting upon appearance without recognizing well-being, and a stigmatizing. I know that none of our schools would deliberately develop a stigmatizing environment, but sometimes a lack of understanding and a lack of awareness. One can also imagine, for example, I was thinking about ARFID, where a child is eating a highly restrictive diet, that somebody in the school with really good intentions might say, oh, try this one, it's not the same brand, but go on, have a go, and puts pressure on without understanding the nature of ARFID and the underlying mechanisms of it. Next slide, please. So these were the top tips that the young people came up with. I see those comments about the lack of early help and lack of early support, and we must take that very, very seriously. But the young people say, don't, for goodness sake, don't wait for us to get really ill before you help us. How can that help anybody? Because by then our biology has been impacted and it becomes entrenched. Make sure there are supported, trusted and emotionally available staff in school. Young person said, don't be afraid to take the first step. I actually remember the young person who said this when we wrote it down, and she said that she had lost a huge amount of weight, a huge amount, and her teacher, with whom she had a really, really good rapport, just said, do you mind if we have a quick chat? And she said, look, I may be saying the wrong thing, so just tell me to be quiet. But I've noticed that you have lost a huge amount of weight, and because I care about you, I'm just conveying my concern and asking you if there's anything I can do. And this young person said it was an utter relief for somebody to say that, to help them get support. I mean, I know that not every teacher would feel comfortable with doing that, and nobody's saying that every teacher should, but somehow or another to put in those caveats. Look, what I'm saying may be unwelcome, and please understand it's said with good intentions, but I'm just conveying concern for a student that I care a great deal about. Once we know that children have got mental health problems, having safety plans using the YPC, the Young People Cornwall Health and Wellbeing Roadmap, is really, really a really good thing. And the young people like it, and they can draw their safety plans and they can write down what's helpful in schools if they know they have an eating problem. It's really important to remember that an eating disorder is a mental health problem. It's a well-being problem. It's a psychological problem. It's a reflection of struggles and relationships and social media pressures. For some reason, the young people were absolutely insistent to me that they liked the phrase balanced eating rather than going on and on about healthy eating. Remember that eating disorder is often a very, very secret problem, and that young people can be very, very secretive and very hiding of it. Always treat the young person with respect and adopt a very non-judgmental approach. Non-stigmatizing environments, not talking about in inappropriate ways or without recognizing the difficulties of BMAs and calories in classes all the time. In the last one was really interesting. The young people said, have check-ins with students known to be struggling, even if they appear okay. Because some of the students say, you know, it's a bit worrying, you know, I start to look a little bit better and then nobody's so interested in me and I still need their help. So what I'd really like from the teachers to just say, how are things going? Do you still need a chat? And not to say, even though you're looking a bit better, because sometimes that produces a great deal of ambivalence in the young person. So just to keep having those regular check-ins if you know a young person has been struggling, even if they're on a very positive trajectory of getting better.
We've got a question for you, Lynette, there. If a child eats too little and nutrition is a problem, is it better to let them eat poor foods rather than no food, little food?
This is a very common issue among what we call ARFID children. That is, children with a highly restricted diet who may just like things of a particular color or a particular texture. So here's my answer to this. The short answer is yes. It is better to let them eat poor foods from our point of view, because most foods have some nutritional content. But I would also seek the advice of primary care and dietitians, just to make sure, because I'm not quite sure what poor foods are and whether poor foods would be nutritional enough. But I work with a child who would only eat white bread and dairy cream cheese spread on it. That was all. I mean, morning, noon and night. But when we got the dietitian in to really help us, her point of view was, well, at least there is some nutrition in the cheese of dairy spread, there's some nutrition in the butter on the bread, and there's some nutrition in the bread. It's not a varied diet, and we will work with this, but eat that. Just keep going with that as a beginning of our journey together. So my short answer is probably yes, but I would want dietitians' advice on that just to check. I hope that, Nick, that's... Oh, you've got your hand up, so perhaps you want to answer that.
Yeah, so The child actually that I'm thinking of does have quite a good list of healthy foods that they will eat. And we do provide a range of different things and choices, but it's really difficult because it's hard to tell when kind of behavior and patterns are kind of taking over also. And then when I say poor foods, I mean like whole packets of biscuits, even though there are options of other things that are liked, that would be fruit and vegetables, but they're provided with often sugary foods, and it makes me quite anxious.
Well, I understand that because you and I know that sugary foods can be very addictive to children, and can be eaten in preference. If this is a child with ARFID or some eating problems, it's worth developing a very collaborative approach across the family and GP or dietitians, so that you get a really collaborative approach, so that you're all doing the same thing. You've all got a plan, and the child understands that plan. So I think otherwise it's too much pressure on teachers or people who are leading other activities to make these decisions and these choices. So we need the family and the dietitian working together on, well, we've got the child for today, what's the best approach to this, and how are you working with this, and what foods are available? I hope that's helpful.
That's fantastic, thank you.
Okay, I'm aware, next slide please, that we have reached 5 o'clock, I believe, or nearly at 5 o'clock. I just wanted to say that there are other agencies out there, and that the I Thrive pathway across the 4 quadrants does enable there to be some expertise in relation to eating problems and eating disorders across all quadrants of care. So in quadrant 1, we have lots of information, including this, public health information, we have primary health, we have dietitians, we have health visitors trained up in this. We also have many organizations nationally that provide really, really good websites and helpful advice, such as Young Minds, such as Anna Freud, and such as highly specialist, like BEAT, organizations for food. We also have Head Start, we also have YPC and other websites locally that are extremely helpful. And we have organizations that are developing expertise for getting some help, not necessarily the highly specialist help of CAMS. So we might have MHSTs in some primary schools, and we have third sector organizations and well-being practitioners who will develop some expertise in this prior to CAMS. But I also recognize, I'm not naive, some of the comments made in the chat room about the difficulties in relation to early help and how vital it is to improve that. And I agree, nobody's criticizing, we're all doing our best, but early intervention and getting support as soon as possible before problems get embedded and get entrenched and get out of hand because of the biological mechanisms that get set in place once it's entrenched. One can also take from schools to Bloom to get advice and guidance if one's worried about blooming eating problems. Trauma-informed schools and the trauma-informed practitioners in schools will have some attachment-based guidance in relation to relationships to food or underlying struggles. And mental health workers are embedded in some of our primary schools. So we hope that there's a pattern around us. I'm not saying it's a perfect pattern, but if we're just developing our understanding, and this is one way to begin it. As I said at the beginning, the guidance that has come out to you is far more detailed, and I have it next to me. I don't have the glossy printed version that Lucy has, but it's quite long. It's 35 pages long, so it's quite a detailed one. It has lots of the websites in, it has lots of the advice and guidance, it has referral pathways, it has ways of opening and starting sentences, it has ways of dealing with confidentiality, because if you're very worried about a child and you want to talk about the family and you want the child's permission, talking about issues of confidentiality, there's guidance in relation to that. The guidance will be sent out with this training, as I understand it. Am I correct, Tracy?
I believe so, Lynette.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
or at least we'll give people access to, access it.
Yeah,
so
I think
just to confirm, I think we've in terms of hard copies, we're a little more limited. Absolutely, we'll be sharing electronic versions, and as well as all of the PowerPoint and this recording. But if anyone would like to drop me an email, I can see what I can do around the hard copies. I'll pop my email in the chat.
It is easy to send the PowerPoint and the guidance out together electronically to everybody, every participant in this anyway, isn't it? So I've only run over 2 minutes this time, Lucy, opposed to running over 9 minutes last time.
Thank you so much.
I do have time for questions, and if anybody wants to ask a brief question, but I'm also grateful for feedback. We're doing this again, so if I got something wrong or you want something more elaborated, to send us feedback so that I can change the presentation. That's gratefully received, because we're all on a steep learning curve on this together.
Absolutely, thank you, Lynette. That was fantastic. But as you said, welcome feedback around today's session and kind of how it was working, kind of a hybrid of resources, hard copies, electronic versions. This opportunity to join together to discuss the toolkit. And we're looking to certainly build on the topics that are covered, and with kind of the Head Start model of a wellbeing hub to continue the discussion in terms of potentially like a forum or network where because we appreciate that sometimes it's an ongoing thing, and it's great to have a base where you can kind of seek reference or support, or just have a conversation with your peers and colleagues. So please, evaluation forms, kind of the official ones, will come out via some brilliant links, I'm sure, but we really appreciate your feedback and how we can continue to have this interaction, maximizing the the virtual kind of technology. I'll just check the chat a second. Lots of thanks, Lynette, as always. Yeah, thank you, Claire, for saying get all the resources out to you. That's great. Again, thank you, Susan, for sharing that concerns about kind of it's not always in your professional role, but in we're all human beings with families, and again for your own well-being. So that's certainly what we the support is there for everyone. Great, thanks, Lynette. I think I'll just stay on till everyone kind of appreciate end of the day now.